If you've ever imagined that every prophet in the Bible appeared with unshakable courage, delivering divine messages with unwavering faith, then the prophet Habakkuk might surprise you. His story doesn't begin with a bold declaration, it begins with a cry, not a sermon to the people, but a silent struggle with God himself. Right from the first verse, he doesn't proclaim, he pleads, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear?" Habakkuk 1:2. These words weren't spoken to impress anyone. They came from a heart caught between faith and reality, between hope and the ache of abandonment. Yes, Habakkuk was a prophet, but first, he was a human being, a man of flesh and blood, living in a time when Judah was rotting from within. Injustice ran rampant. The wicked thrived openly while the righteous were crushed. And God, the very God he trusted, seemed silent. Yet instead of turning away, Habakkuk chose to engage, not to accuse, but to seek, because he believed that God does not fear honest questions. Habakkuk didn't display a faith that was neatly packaged. His faith was forged in fire, shaped in silence, strengthened through wrestling. His journey wasn't a straight path, but a winding road of doubts, laments, and long nights of waiting. He doesn't tell of dazzling encounters with God, but of a soul learning to worship even when nothing made sense, because he believed God was still listening. And if you find yourself in that place right now, waiting in silence, praying prayers that seem to go unanswered, watching injustice unfold while wondering where God is, then Habakkuk's story might feel closer than ever. Because he discovered something profound. God's silence is not the same as his absence. And sometimes our boldest questions are what lead us closer to him. So stay with this journey. Because Habakkuk's story doesn't end in lament. The deeper it goes, the more something extraordinary begins to happen, not just in his circumstances, but in his soul. And maybe in yours too. Don't forget to like and subscribe to explore more powerful and meaningful Bible stories with us. Now, let's step into today's special feature, the full story of Habakkuk, the prophet who dared to question God's silence. To understand the cries of Habakkuk, we must first step into the collapsing world he knew. It wasn't just a time of political chaos or social unrest. It was a spiritual implosion that threatened the soul of a nation once chosen by God. Judah, the southern kingdom, once held up as the last ember of David's throne, and the vessel of divine promise, was breaking apart from the inside. Kings ruled in violence and fear. The temple still stood, but its sacredness had faded into hollow ritual. God's law, once the moral compass of the nation, had become something leaders manipulated instead of obeyed. Justice, which once inspired prophetic visions of rivers rolling with righteousness, had been dammed up, diverted, and sold to the highest bidder. The religious and political elite, those who should have guarded the covenant, instead led the people into deception, idolatry, and moral decay. This wasn't just political failure, it was a collapse of identity, a spiritual disintegration. The people of the covenant had become numb to their own rebellion. What once would have been seen as sin had become normalized, even institutionalized. Violence wasn't an exception, it was embedded in everyday life. In Habakkuk 1:3, the prophet pleads, "Why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look on wickedness? Destruction and violence are before me, strife exists and contention arises." These aren't the distant complaints of a man writing from safety. These are the cries of someone standing in the ruins, overwhelmed by the moral collapse around him. The repeated use of words like iniquity, violence, and destruction paints a picture not just of a nation in trouble, but of a society so saturated with sin that failure had become a way of life. But for Habakkuk, what hurts even more than the evil itself is the silence of God, the God who had once split the sea, thundered from Sinai, and led with fire and cloud, now seems absent. Gone is the voice that guided the prophets, that warned the kings, that stirred the people to repentance. The prophet doesn't doubt God's existence, he questions God's involvement. And this is a question that hasn't faded with time. It's a question whispered in hospital rooms, shouted in war zones, and wept over in silent bedrooms. Where is God when injustice prevails and the righteous suffer? What makes this silence so painful is Judah's history, a history rich with divine acts. From the victories under Joshua to the reforms of kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, God had moved with power and compassion. They had seen God act before, seen the fire, the judgment, the mercy. But now, in the face of rising wickedness, the heavens are quiet. No prophet thunders warnings, no miracles disrupt the decline, no signs break the darkness, only silence. And in a land once filled with divine whispers and sacred rituals, that silence is deafening. The altar feels abandoned. The covenant sounds like an old song nobody sings anymore. Habakkuk's lament isn't just about injustice. It's about faith hanging by a thread. Faith that dares to question, not out of defiance, but out of desperate hope. He doesn't walk away from God. He turns toward Him, boldly and vulnerably, asking the questions many are too afraid to speak. This is where the heart of the book takes shape, in the space between God's promise and human pain. And it's here that Habakkuk's voice becomes not just ancient, but urgent. As we listen to his words, we aren't just studying history, we're staring into a mirror. Because the patterns of collapse, corrupt leadership, lost truth, unanswered prayer, aren't just Judah's, they're ours too. So what do we do in that silence? Do we abandon our questions? Or do we, like Habakkuk, stand our ground, lift our voices and wrestle with the silence until it breaks? The world Habakkuk lived in may be centuries behind us, but its spiritual landscape is hauntingly familiar. And perhaps that's the point. The silence of God isn't the end of the story. In naming it, in crying out within it, Habakkuk begins a conversation that reshapes his understanding of justice, mercy, and faith. His sorrow doesn't drive him away, it draws him deeper. And in doing so, he speaks not just to his generation, but to every generation that has ever stood in the dark, waiting for the voice of a God who sometimes seems hidden, but never absent. After Judah's moral unraveling and a suffocating silence from heaven, the voice that rises is not triumphant, but tormented. The prophet Habakkuk doesn't open with declarations or visions. His first words slice through the silence, not as a proclamation, but as a plea soaked in sorrow and urgency. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save? Habakkuk 1:2. This is no ordinary complaint. It is a spiritual outcry from a man who has seen too much and heard too little from the God he still believes in. Habakkuk doesn't speak from a place of disbelief, but from the raw edge of faith stretched thin. His repetition, cry for help, cry to you, carries the weight of relentless prayer, of nights spent watching injustice run rampant while heaven stays silent. His question is not cynical. It is the cry of someone who expects God to respond, who knows God is righteous and can't reconcile that knowledge with the unchecked evil in the streets. Habakkuk's lament captures an ancient and familiar tension, the gap between God's promises and life's brutal realities. This isn't new in the story of faith. The prophets and poets of Israel often lifted their voices not just in praise, but in protest. David once cried, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" Psalm 13:1. Job, crushed by suffering, asked, "Why was I not born dead?" Job 3:11. And on the cross, Jesus echoed the ancient cry of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew 27:46. Habakkuk's voice joins this lineage, not with quiet doubt, but with loud, holy defiance. His lament is part of a sacred tradition, Not the rebellion of faithless hearts, but the desperate prayers of those who still believe God listens. What makes Habakkuk's cry unique is his refusal to let the silence win. He doesn't walk away, he doesn't shrug off the darkness. Instead, he moves closer to God, pressing in, not with polished words, but with raw, unsettling honesty. That, in itself, is faith. Notice the Hebrew word he uses for violence, Hamas. It isn't just physical brutality, it points to systemic injustice, corruption that poisons courts, rulers who exploit the weak, a society where the law has no teeth and justice is warped. The law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. Habakkuk 1:4. This isn't abstract theology. This is the cry of someone watching his nation rot from within. Habakkuk sees what others ignore, and it tears at him. He refuses to look away. That refusal becomes a kind of worship, a painful, persistent demand for a holy God to act. And that's where we pause, because right now there's no answer. Only the prophet's raw, unresolved cry hanging in the air. The tension between what he believes and what he sees remains unrelieved. But in his protest, there's a clue to deeper truth. Faith doesn't live in the land of easy answers. It begins in the space where the heart breaks and still reaches out toward God. As we continue through Habakkuk's story, we will eventually hear God speak, but his reply will not offer immediate relief. Instead, it will challenge Habakkuk's expectations and stretch his understanding of justice and timing. The prophet will be forced to wrestle with a vision of divine action that may not look like justice at first glance. But for now, we stay with him, inside the ache, inside the silence that follows a desperate prayer. Because this is where many of us live, in the waiting, in the wondering, in the hope that somehow, even when God seems quiet, he is not absent. And that in time, the silence will break, not with explanation, but with revelation. How long, O Lord? Habakkuk's desperate cry echoes not just across his own time, but into every age where suffering meets silence. He doesn't receive a comforting answer, no sudden miracle, no divine explanation, only the quiet intensifying of his internal struggle. What we witness here isn't doubt disguised as faith, but a raw, unfiltered confrontation with the tension between what he believes and what he sees. This isn't a passing frustration. It's not a theological puzzle to be solved in a study. It's a soul-deep crisis where belief in a righteous, sovereign God seems completely out of step with the brutal chaos unraveling around him. Habakkuk clings to the truth that God is holy and just, but every headline, every injustice, every silent prayer seems to say otherwise. He voices this collision of faith and experience in Habakkuk 1:4. So the law is paralyzed and justice never goes forth, for the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. These words don't come from a man observing from the sidelines. They come from a prophet who knows what the law was meant to do: shape a people into God's image, foster justice, create peace. But instead the law is like a sword snapped in two, useless in battle. Justice isn't just ignored, it's weaponized by the corrupt. The righteous are hemmed in, outnumbered, silenced. The wicked redefine morality and rewrite the rules. This isn't a philosophical dilemma, it's a moral wound, and Habakkuk feels it in his bones. He's not asking why evil exists in theory, he's asking how a holy God can allow evil to thrive unchallenged in the very land he once called his own. The prophet isn't on the brink of disbelief, he's on the edge of heartbreak. He gives voice to those who have prayed into silence, who've watched the innocent suffer and wondered whether heaven has turned its face away. His lament is not blasphemy, it's bravery. He doesn't bury the pain, he brings it to God. And that's where the power of Habakkuk's story lies. He doesn't edit his emotions, He doesn't coat his questions in polite, religious language. His faith isn't one that avoids doubt. It absorbs it. It wrestles. It brings every raw, unresolved emotion into the presence of the God he still refuses to let go of. This makes his lament something more than complaint. It becomes sacred dialogue, not a breakdown of belief, but an act of fierce devotion. Faith, Habakkuk shows us, isn't proved in easy answers. It's proved in the decision to stay in the conversation when there are none. When he speaks of the law being frozen and justice warped, he isn't speaking as a critic looking in. He's a prophet speaking from within. His pain is personal, national, and deeply spiritual. He mourns not only the failure of the system, but the distortion of God's purpose for his people. And Habakkuk is not alone. Across the pages of Scripture, we hear echoes of his struggle. Job sits in ashes and demands an explanation from God. David nearly loses his footing in Psalm 73 as he watches the wicked prosper. Jeremiah weeps over Jerusalem and dares to ask, why do the treacherous thrive? These are not stories of weak faith. They're examples of real faith, faith that can handle hard questions, faith that doesn't settle for cliches, faith that loves God enough to bring him honest pain rather than dishonest praise. Habakkuk's struggle, then, isn't a failure, it's a furnace. And in that furnace, something unshakable begins to form. A trust that doesn't rely on what the eye sees or what the moment feels like. A trust rooted not in clarity, but in character, the character of God, even when hidden behind mystery. This is where prophetic faith is forged, not in certainty, but in surrender, not in answers, but in communion. Habakkuk doesn't find peace through resolution, he finds it through revelation. But before that revelation can come, the pain must be voiced, the injustice named, and the heart laid bare. And he does all of this not to reject God, but to reach for him. His questions aren't rebellion, they are the questions of a heart refusing to let silence have the final word. In the dark, Habakkuk chooses not to walk away, but to wrestle. And that, more than anything, is the sign of a faith both real and resilient. After bearing the deep spiritual conflict between what he believes about God and what he witnesses in his collapsing world, Habakkuk does something unexpected. He doesn't retreat into silence, bitterness, or despair. Instead, he leans in, further, not away. And that choice marks the difference between a faith that survives and one that crumbles. Habakkuk refuses to pretend. He doesn't mask his confusion with theological jargon or hide his outrage behind polite prayers. He brings everything, his grief, his questions, even his frustration, directly into the presence of God. That act alone is powerful because only someone who believes God is real and relational would dare to confront him so honestly. His cry in Habakkuk 1:13 is raw. Why do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? These words may sound irreverent to some, but in truth, they are a form of worship rooted in trust. Habakkuk is not challenging God's existence, he's pleading for God's involvement. This kind of honesty isn't new in Scripture. The pages of the Bible are filled with voices that dared to question God, not to reject him, but to understand him. David, Jeremiah, Elijah, each of them, in moments of deep distress, cried out with boldness. David asked how long God would hide his face, Psalm 13. Jeremiah cursed the day of his birth, Jeremiah 20:18. Elijah, after a dramatic victory, fell into despair and begged to die, 1 Kings 19:4. These weren't moments of faithlessness, they were invitations into deeper relationship. Habakkuk joins that chorus, not by rejecting what he knows of God, but by wrestling with it. He speaks not to accuse, but to seek clarity, to reconcile divine justice with human suffering. And here lies a truth we often forget. Biblical faith isn't about having no doubts. It's about what we do with those doubts. Do we bury them? Or do we, like Habakkuk, bring them into honest conversation with God? Habakkuk's anguish isn't abstract. He isn't speaking from personal disappointment alone. He is watching a nation unravel. Violence, corruption, and injustice aren't just ideas. They are ripping Judah apart. And Habakkuk steps into that devastation as an intercessor. He gives voice to a collective pain, speaking for those too broken, too tired, or too afraid to speak. In that way, his protest becomes more than personal. It becomes priestly. He stands between earth's sorrow and heaven's silence, refusing to accept either as the final word. But Habakkuk doesn't just voice his complaint and walk away. He does something even more radical. He waits. He positions himself to listen, anticipating not validation but revelation. In Habakkuk 2:1 he says, "I will stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower, and I will look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint." Well, this is not a passive waiting. This is active anticipation. He's not expecting easy answers, but he is expecting something. This watchful posture reveals a faith that refuses to give up, even when God seems distant. It's not a blind faith. It's a faith bold enough to demand understanding. Habakkuk teaches us something rare and valuable. Real faith isn't about shutting down difficult questions. It's about asking them reverently, persistently, and with a heart willing to be changed by the answer. And what's remarkable is that God does not rebuke him. There is no divine slap on the wrist, no dismissal of his grief. God responds, but the response isn't comfort. It's a vision that will stretch Habakkuk's understanding and test his trust in entirely new ways. But before that vision comes, we're asked to linger in the space between question and answer, to sit with the tension and to recognize that in this waiting, faith is being forged. This is where relationship with God deepens, not in the absence of doubt, but in the willingness to bring it into the conversation. As Habakkuk waits, we are reminded that sometimes the most sacred moments happen not in resolution, but in the honest cry of the heart that still believes God is listening. After Habakkuk pours out his lament, demanding answers from God with raw honesty and trembling hope, the long-awaited divine reply finally comes. But instead of comfort or a clear vindication of justice, what the prophet hears is shocking, almost offensive. For a man desperate to see corruption in Judah punished and righteousness restored, God's response does not settle the tension. It intensifies it. The answer doesn't soothe, it shakes. It's a revelation that strips away human expectations and confronts the prophet with the wild, uncontainable nature of divine sovereignty. In Habakkuk 1:5, God begins with an invitation. "Look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told." At first, this seems like a promise that justice is near, that something mighty and redemptive is underway. But the twist comes swiftly and painfully. God's justice will not arise from within Judah. It will not come through a reformer or a spiritual revival. Instead, God declares he is raising up the Babylonians, called the Chaldeans in some translations, a ruthless empire known for its violence and conquest. "I am raising up the Chaldeans," God says in Habakkuk 1:6, "that bitter and hasty nation who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own." This declaration would have hit Habakkuk like a blow to the chest. To think that this brutal nation, feared across the known world, would be used as an instrument in the hands of the holy God is deeply disturbing. These were not people of virtue. Their armies devoured nations, leaving cities in ruin and people enslaved. Yet God not only allows their rise, he takes credit for it. This doesn't just upend Habakkuk's expectations. It overturns his entire framework for understanding how justice should work. Instead of punishing Judah's sins through purification or leadership reform, God will discipline his people through a force more corrupt than they are. The irony is piercing. The theological implications are hard to bear. How can the God of covenant, the God of Israel, work through those who desecrate everything he stands for? And yet this is the point where the narrative deepens. It's here we encounter a core truth. God's justice is not always immediate, obvious, or aligned with human logic, but it is never absent. The story reminds us that God's sense of timing, method, and morality transcends ours. He does not operate on demand or within our preferred boundaries. This divine strategy forces Habakkuk and us to confront a more unsettling, more profound vision of who God is, a God who is not just a deliverer, but a sovereign ruler of history, a God who doesn't explain himself to fit our sense of fairness, but invites us into deeper trust. Isaiah 55, 8-9 echoes this truth. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways. God is not irrational, but he is beyond what we can fully grasp. By revealing that he will use Babylon as a tool of judgment, God isn't shutting down Habakkuk's voice, he's stretching it. He's inviting the prophet into a deeper kind of faith, a trust not grounded in visible outcomes but in the character of the one who holds the future. Justice will come, that much is certain, but it will not come through expected means. It will arrive on a road that demands humility and eyes that see beyond the surface. This is perhaps one of the most difficult truths in the book. God's answers often unsettle more than they soothe, but they are never without meaning. As Habakkuk stands in the tension between divine promise and disturbing reality, he and we must make a choice: to recoil in fear and confusion, or to press on, continuing to listen, seek, and trust. The path forward leads through Babylon. The revelation has come, but the wrestling continues, and through that struggle faith grows, not in what God does, but in who he is. After crying out for justice, Habakkuk receives an answer from God, but not the one he expected. Instead of immediate rescue, instead of judgment against Judah's corruption, God reveals a far more unsettling plan. He will raise up the Babylonians, a brutal and merciless empire, as his instrument of judgment. Suddenly the prophet is thrust into a spiritual crisis. The very God he turned to for justice now appears to be using injustice to punish injustice. Habakkuk's assumptions about divine fairness are shattered. What happens when the cure seems worse than the disease? When God's ways feel more confusing than comforting? Habakkuk stands at a crossroads. He could choose bitterness, disbelief, even rebellion. But instead, a subtle and powerful transformation begins, not in the world around him, but in his own soul. This moment becomes the turning point in his journey. His faith, once tied to understanding, now begins to mature into something deeper: trust without full clarity. That kind of faith doesn't form overnight. It doesn't come easily. Habakkuk doesn't leap from confusion to confidence in a single breath. He struggles, he waits, he listens. Slowly, he begins to release his grip on needing all the answers. He starts building his hope not on what God will do next, but on who God has always been. And then, in Habakkuk 2:4, God delivers a phrase that becomes a cornerstone of Scripture: "The righteous shall live by his faith." This brief line becomes the anchor not only for Habakkuk's evolving theology, but later for the Apostle Paul's teaching on salvation itself. It will echo again in Romans and Galatians as the foundation for justification by faith. Here in the Old Testament, in the middle of turmoil and uncertainty, that truth is first spoken. It reminds us that in times of chaos, Survival is not about control, power, or certainty, but about a rooted confidence in God's character. Faith becomes the path, not just the destination. What's remarkable is that Habakkuk stays present. He doesn't flee the conversation. He doesn't allow unanswered questions to harden his heart. Instead, he leans in. He continues to listen, even when the answers are hard, even when they hurt. And that openness begins to reshape not just what he believes, but how he believes. By the time we reach chapter 3, something has changed. Habakkuk is no longer arguing with God about timing or outcomes. He isn't bargaining for blessings or pleading for immediate deliverance. Instead, he prays. And his prayer isn't one of desperation, it's one of worship. In some of the most poetic and powerful lines in the Bible, he declares, "Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will take joy in the God of my salvation." These aren't words of a man who got what he wanted. They are the words of someone who discovered that God himself is enough. This is a different kind of faith, not blind optimism, not denial of suffering. It's a faith that sees the storm and still sings, a faith that isn't built on outcomes, but on the unshakable nature of God. Habakkuk doesn't pretend the pain is gone, but he proclaims something greater, that God is still worthy, even in the dark. And as the final chapter closes, Habakkuk's voice rises, not with fear, but with confidence. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on high places. This is a vision of faith fully formed. Like a deer scaling cliffs with ease, Habakkuk now moves through life's treacherous terrain with divine strength underfoot. His transformation from raw lament to radiant trust isn't about escaping struggle, it's about meeting God in the middle of it. He teaches us that real faith isn't born in comfort, it's forged in wrestling, in waiting, in wondering, in worshipping anyway. And so the story of Habakkuk is not just ancient prophecy, it's the story of every believer who has prayed through tears, questioned in silence, and still chosen to trust. It's a faith that doesn't run from suffering, but walks through it. That doesn't demand to understand, but dares to believe. In the end, this journey is not about getting all the answers. It's about encountering the one who holds them. And in that encounter, even in the ruins, we find a joy that no devastation can destroy. Habakkuk emerges not into peace, but into perspective. The violence in Judah still rages. Babylon's threat hasn't faded. Injustice still roams the streets unchecked. But something has changed, not the world outside, but the world inside him. Fear has been replaced by confidence. Confusion has given way to a quiet strength. His questions may not be fully answered, but his heart has been anchored by a deeper encounter with God. Here, in the space between pain and surrender, the prophet discovers a new kind of hope. Not a hope based on improvement or outcomes, but one rooted in God's unchanging character. This isn't wishful thinking, it's not emotional escape. It's the result of facing suffering head-on, naming it, wrestling with it, and still choosing to trust that behind the silence, God remains faithful. Habakkuk now understands that when God seems silent, he is not absent. When his justice feels delayed, it is not denied. Hope, he learns, isn't pretending things are fine. Hope is believing God is good, even when things aren't. God had already told him, the vision awaits its appointed time. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. That reminder shifts the prophet's entire outlook. He stops demanding instant action and instead commits to faithful waiting. His hope becomes a decision, a discipline, a choice to believe in the long game of God's justice. This kind of hope doesn't collapse when the world does. It doesn't rely on prosperity, peace, or clarity. It stands firm on the character of God alone. And then Habakkuk puts his faith into song. In his final chapter, he offers a hymn that has echoed through centuries. He sings, "Though the fig tree does not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will be joyful in God my Saviour." In an ancient world where survival depended on crops and livestock, these words are radical. He declares that even if every earthly source of stability fails, his joy will not. That is not circumstantial faith, that is covenantal faith. He is not rejoicing because his situation has changed, but because his perspective has. His worship is rooted in who God is, not what life gives. His praise comes not after deliverance, but in the middle of uncertainty. This kind of hope challenges us today. It doesn't ask us to close our eyes to the brokenness around us. It calls us to stay awake in it and still trust. Habakkuk teaches us that hope doesn't grow in ease. It grows when we choose to cling to God despite what we see. Hope becomes a witness, not just within us, but through us, for others who are also walking through the dark. His song reaches its highest point in a future promise. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. He doesn't see it yet, but he believes it. That belief is enough to turn sorrow into song and despair into worship. His present becomes bearable not because the pain is gone, but because the promise remains. True hope, as Habakkuk shows, is not passive waiting. It is the bold, steady choice to trust God through the storm. It gives us strength to walk through chaos with peace, to sing even while we grieve, to believe even before we see. Because even if the fig tree never blossoms, the God of our salvation never fails. The story of Habakkuk begins in a place of sorrow and protest where the prophet dares to raise his voice against the silence of heaven. He cries out in confusion, aching for justice in a world that seems ruled by chaos. And yet what makes this journey so powerful is not a sudden miracle or reversal of fortune, but a transformation that unfolds within the prophet himself. Habakkuk's world hasn't changed. Judah remains vulnerable, corruption still poisons the nation, and the threat of Babylonian invasion still casts a long shadow. Yet something within Habakkuk is different. The man who once trembled in uncertainty now stands in reverent awe. His faith, once shaken, has been reshaped, not by explanations, but by an encounter with the greatness of God. This remarkable shift is captured in Habakkuk chapter 3, a poetic prayer that feels more like a psalm than prophecy. It is a hymn not of resolution, but of revelation. The chapter opens with a prayer that reaches into Israel's sacred memory, invoking the acts of God in days long past. "O Lord, I have heard the report of you," the prophet says. "In the midst of the years, revive it. In wrath, remember mercy." Here, Habakkuk acknowledges a truth many overlook, that God's justice carries both power and compassion. Even in judgment, mercy is never absent. This isn't a retreat into nostalgia. It's a bold reminder that the God who delivered Israel through the Red Sea, who thundered at Sinai, and who led his people through deserts and battles, is still the same God now. Then comes a stunning vision, a theophany, where God appears not as a distant observer but as a divine warrior in motion. Habakkuk describes his coming from Teman, his splendor like the sunrise, the earth trembling beneath his feet. These aren't just poetic images, they're echoes of history intended to awaken faith in a God whose past victories are a promise of his present power. The message is clear: even when divine justice feels delayed, even when the world seems governed by the wicked, God has not changed. The one who marched before his people still moves, still rules, still saves. But Habakkuk does not pretend to be fearless. He confesses honestly, "My body trembles, my lips quiver, rottenness enters my bones." He feels the weight of divine revelation. His body reacts with dread. Yet this trembling becomes sacred ground, the place where fear gives birth to trust. And then, in one of the most defiant declarations of faith in all of Scripture, Habakkuk proclaims, "Though the fig tree does not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will take joy in the God of my salvation." This isn't optimism, it's worship born in the wilderness. In ancient Judah, the loss of crops and livestock meant disaster, economic ruin, national instability, even starvation. But the prophet sings from within that loss. He doesn't wait for restoration, he worships in the ruin. Habakkuk's praise doesn't deny pain, it stares it down. His joy is not a result of blessings returned, it's rooted in a relationship with the God who stands sovereign over every storm. His worship isn't naive, it's courageous. It says, even if everything fails, God remains worthy. This movement from lament to praise is not a tidy resolution. It's a holy wrestling match that ends in surrender, not defeat. The prophet teaches us something essential. True worship is not what happens when prayers are answered, but what rises from the heart when they are not. His closing words ring with resolve. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on high places. In ancient imagery, deer moved confidently across rugged mountains. In that metaphor, we see a man who once stumbled, now running sure-footed, not because the path is easy, but because he has learned to trust the guide. Habakkuk's journey doesn't give us neat answers. It gives us something deeper, a way of seeing, a way of walking. He teaches us that faith is not the absence of protest, but the refusal to let despair win. That worship is not pretending all is well, but declaring that God is still good, even when all else fails. In the end, the prophet's story becomes a song, not because his world has changed, but because he has. And in that transformation lies the essence of biblical worship, not escape from suffering, but steadfast praise in the middle of it. Not because the storm has passed, but because the God who commands the storm is still near. As the final lines of Habakkuk's prayer echo into silence, what lingers is more than just the story of one man's spiritual wrestling. It is a legacy of enduring truth. Habakkuk's journey isn't locked in the past, bound to the fall of ancient Judah. It speaks powerfully today, cutting across cultures, generations, and personal crises. His book isn't just a prophecy, it's a mirror held up to the heart of every believer who has ever stood in the dark, asking God why. At its core, the message of Habakkuk reveals a transformative truth. Authentic faith does not silence questions. It brings them to God. The prophets cry, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not hear?" Habakkuk 1:2 is not a complaint wrapped in doubt, but a lament grounded in trust. These words are fierce and full of feeling, not whispered in detachment, but shouted from the depths of covenantal relationship. Habakkuk believes God hears. And because he believes, he dares to speak. One of the most profound lessons his story teaches is that God does not recoil from our raw honesty. He invites it. Habakkuk shows us that the sacred space between confusion and clarity is not a place of spiritual failure, but often the place where real transformation begins. Faith grows not by avoiding the tension, but by walking through it with God. Closely tied to this honesty is the prophetic call to wait. When God finally answers Habakkuk's lament, he doesn't promise instant rescue. He lays out a long process of judgment and redemption. The message, for still the vision awaits its appointed time. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come, it will not delay. Habakkuk 2:3. Waiting becomes holy. It's no longer passive, but filled with active hope, a posture that says, even when I don't see the answer, I trust the one who gave the promise. It's in this posture that Habakkuk's faith begins to mature. His dependence shifts. He moves from needing immediate intervention to anchoring himself in God's character. This turning point is captured in one brief but powerful phrase: "The righteous shall live by his faith." Habakkuk 2:4. These words are not just for Habakkuk's moment. They're echoed centuries later by Paul in Romans and Galatians, and again in the Book of Hebrews. They form the foundation of Christian teaching on justification by faith. And in Habakkuk's time they become a beacon for surviving moral decay and spiritual silence, not through strength, but through steadfast trust. Another vital lesson surfaces in the prophet's final chapter. Having walked through anguish, confusion, and revelation, Habakkuk doesn't end with demands or despair. He ends in worship. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. Habakkuk 3:17-18. This is radical praise. It's not the voice of a man who got what he wanted. It's the declaration of someone who has seen enough of God to say, even if nothing changes, God is still worthy. This is faith stripped of conditions, faith that rejoices not in blessings but in the blesser. Habakkuk doesn't pretend the pain has disappeared, but he lifts his eyes above it. He teaches us that true joy isn't rooted in outcome, but in the presence of a God whose goodness isn't defined by circumstances. And this changes everything. It redefines what it means to live faithfully in a broken world. Habakkuk does not retreat into personal piety while his society crumbles. He steps into the chaos. He names the injustice. He speaks truth to power. His spirituality isn't private, it's prophetic. It refuses to ignore the crisis and instead meets it head-on with God's heart. More than that, Habakkuk's journey reminds us that pain doesn't have to isolate us. It can become a platform. His lament becomes a prophetic voice. His private struggle turns into a public witness. Through his honesty and endurance, his personal agony becomes a message of hope for others. His story affirms that suffering doesn't signal God's absence. It's often where intimacy with God is forged. And that's the beauty of his legacy. Habakkuk doesn't leave us with formulas. He offers a rhythm: anguish, dialogue, waiting, worship. This rhythm echoes in the lives of so many believers. The journey of faith is not linear. It bends through seasons of doubt, moments of revelation, and acts of praise that rise not because of clarity, but because of trust. In the end, Habakkuk teaches us that it's possible to question without crumbling, to wait without giving up, and to worship even when nothing around us has changed. The deepest faith is not the one that explains everything. It's the one that, when explanations fail, still says, "God the Lord is my strength." Habakkuk 3:19. And that's the invitation left to us, not just to admire Habakkuk's faith, but to live it, to hold fast in the silence, to speak honestly, to wait patiently, to worship boldly, and through it all to find our joy not in what we see, but in the God who sees us. As we reach the conclusion of this journey through the life and message of the prophet Habakkuk, we're not left with a clean resolution or a triumphant ending. Judah still faces the looming storm of Babylon, and injustice still grips the land. But what Habakkuk leaves us with is something far more profound, a spiritual invitation. It's not a victory through political restoration or national revival, but a victory of the soul, a victory in the heart of a man who dared to face God with raw honesty, who remained in conversation even when heaven was silent, and who emerged not with all the answers, but with a deeper trust in the one who holds them. From his opening cry, "Or how long, O Lord?" to his final declaration, "Yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will take joy in the God of my salvation," Habakkuk's journey becomes a living testimony of a faith that matures through crisis. What makes Habakkuk's story so relevant today isn't just the timelessness of his questions or the poetic power of his response. It's his spiritual courage, the kind of courage it takes to stay in conversation with God, even when the answers disturb more than they comfort. Habakkuk teaches us that true faith doesn't fear hard questions. That doubt is not the opposite of devotion. In fact, it's often in the wrestling, just like Jacob at Peniel, that our faith is shaped and our identity as God's people is forged. He does not call us to blind optimism or passive waiting. He calls us to active trust, rooted in who God has revealed himself to be. The prophetic vision in Habakkuk 2:14, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea," is not just poetic, it is a divine guarantee. Justice will prevail, though not always on our timeline. So this book becomes more than history or theology. It becomes a guide for those walking through the chaos of life with uncertain faith. It shows us that lament and worship can exist together, that doubt and trust can live side by side in a sincere heart, that our questions, when brought before God in humility, can lead us to a faith not only deeper, but more rooted in the mercy and sovereignty of the Creator. Now the question is no longer, what did Habakkuk learn, but how will we respond? Will we stay present with God in seasons of confusion? Will we learn to wait not in despair, but in expectation, trusting that though the vision tarries, it will come? Will our suffering become the soil where deeper worship grows? Will our uncertainty press us not away from God, but closer to his eternal purposes? This is not a call to ignore injustice or hide sorrow. It is a call to bring both our pain and our protest into sacred conversation with the one who sees, who knows, and who, in his perfect timing, will act. It is a call to live by faith, not just when the fig tree blossoms or the vines bear fruit, but even when the barns are empty and the fields yield nothing. It's a call to worship not only in triumph, but in trial, to stand firm in the knowledge that the God who once delivered his people with a mighty hand is still writing his story of redemption in us and through us. Let the message of Habakkuk stir something in you. Let it deepen your prayers, challenge your assumptions, and stretch your endurance. Choose to rejoice in the God of your salvation, not because every question is answered, but because he is enough. And as you walk the road ahead, may you be counted among those who, like the prophet, live not by sight, but by faith, believing that even in the silence God is still speaking, and even in the waiting, he is still moving. Thank you for watching this video. Every Bible story is a journey back to God, nurturing the faith we all seek. If this journey spoke to you, please click like to share the message and subscribe to walk with us through more meaningful stories. See you in the next video, and may God bless you and your family.